40.3 million people are being victimized of human trafficking. 81% of 40.3 million people are trapped into forced labor. 75 are female victims and 25% are children. This is a statement from Bradley Miles, a author at the Polaris Hotline website. Polaris offers statistics on human trafficking and other articles on what to do to stop it. Kathleen Preble, a social worker at Mizzou, wrote an article on human trafficking and stated human trafficking as the following. It's an umbrella term for the exploitation of a person that includes sex and labor trafficking. It is the most basic terms. It is essentially the compelling of a person to perform commercial sex acts, exchanging sex for something of value, such as money or any other labor, through the use of fraud, force, and coercion. Human trafficking is based off three principles: force, fraud, and coercion. Force is the act of controlling the victim in many ways, including domestic violence, introduction to substance abuse, restrictions, feeling powerless, and many, many more. But it's also important to know what Stacey Litnum stated. She is a mental health counselor at Moore Counseling and Meditation Services. She states that it is important to know that not all victims of human trafficking experience substance abuse. The next principle is fraud and coercion. Fraud is the action of luring an individual using false promises into the human trafficking trade. This is simply a ad on Facebook or an ad on Craigslist that could offer a job and may say something like easy work, lot of money, or something like that. The next is coercion, and that is basically paired with fraud just because they are lying about that job. It is not an actual job. They will hold the victims captive and they will make them work, and the perpetrators are taking all of the victims' money. So they're basically working for free. Stacey Littman also states that for many victims of forced labor, fraud is a strategy used by traffickers to exploit dreams or hopes for a better life. Some characteristics of victims of human trafficking is many. There are many characteristics of these individuals, such as trust of others, homelessness, social media. So the first one of trust of others, Stacey Litnum also states in the same article as before, the majority of the victims in the United States are trafficked domestically, with an increase of minors recruited from the Midwest. When she says trafficked domestically, she means is that victims are trafficked by someone that they know and trust. So this could happen from people at home or their friends or their family, mostly distant family. So that is one characteristic. So always be on the lookout for people who may are trying to manipulate you. Homelessness is another characteristic. Bradley Miles from Polaris gathered information on human trafficking and states that in 2017, 421 homeless youth were victimized of human trafficking. The trafficker will know who's homeless and who has been homeless for a while. They will also find out who has been homeless in the first 48 hours, and that will be their targeted victim. And they will offer a warm place to stay or food or something for them to come with them, and then that is how they capture them. Social media is another characteristic, and I would say the main characteristic of the more recent years. Anthony, an author from Polaris, wrote an article about social media, and he states that From January 2015 to December 2017, 845 individuals were recruited through social media. And that is just huge to me because everyone that I know is on social media. And and then Littman states that social media websites such as MySpace, Twitter, and Facebook have been identified as frequent tool used by traffickers to recruit adolescents into the trafficking trade. Offenders cited the use of social media websites to contact, groom, and connect with their victims, whereas online advertisements websites such as Craigslist were used to sell their victims. So traffickers are using Facebook, Twitter, MySpace, if people still use MySpace, to attract the victims, and then you're using Craigslist to sell the victims. A subgroup of human trafficking is also labor trafficking. Labor trafficking uses the principles of fraud and coercion, and basically the victims will work for free, and the traffickers will keep all of their money and threaten them if they try to escape that they're going to go after their families. Miles stated in 2017, 1,274 individuals are victims of labor trafficking. Victim characteristics of labor trafficking are basically the same as human trafficking: homeless, social media. Also, immigrants is another characteristic. Polaris, a national hotline, as we talked about earlier, for human trafficking, states that 1,510 were victims in 2017 that were not U.S. citizens, so they were immigrants. You might be wondering what the legality of human trafficking is being done in the United States. Andrea Duncan, a lawyer in St. Louis, Missouri, said in the year 2000, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or TVPA, was put into act to allow prosecutions to be made of human traffickers. That was huge in the year 2000 because that is when human trafficking became very prevalent in the United States, and it just allows the traffickers to be prosecuted. Since we live in Missouri, I looked up statistics on Missouri and what's being done here, and we basically have two different districts of Maine, Missouri, and it is a Western District of Missouri and the Eastern District of Missouri. The Western District of Missouri has been noticed and known to aggressively prosecute traffickers through the internet and other tips they receive. They're the first to use the Act TVPA I just talked about. They have also prosecuted more trafficking crimes than any other U.S. Attorney Office, and Duncan stated that in her article. She also stated that the Department of Justice, the DOJ, granted $900,000 and established an official task force called Human Trafficking Task Force in the Western District of Missouri. The Western District of Missouri is basically Kansas City, right here, and then this is the Eastern District, more towards St. Louis. So they are kind of correlated in the fact that they're very close to each other. Traffickers of each district may exchange victims. So the Eastern District of Missouri is St. Louis, like I said, St. Charles, Clayton, and then a little bit of Columbia. Duncan states that St. Louis falls into the district of the top 10 worst cities in the United States for human trafficking. There are many reasons why the Eastern District has a high rate of human trafficking, and some of them are the Lambert International Airport. That international airport allows planes to go and come, and The next one is nearly half of the high school residents do not graduate from high school in St. Louis or in the Eastern District. That also leads to the characteristics of the victims of human trafficking, because it'll be hard for them to find a decent job with a decent salary, and then this occasionally drives teenagers to go to the streets and get money that way, making them prime candidates for the traffickers. The third reason is due to the trucking companies in St. Louis. These major trucking companies transport cargo to both sides of the river, so to Western District and the Eastern District, and then some will also carry victims as well. The traffickers will contact the truck drivers and make a deal with them, and they will move victims if the law is closing in on a case, and then once the victims are moved, then it's way harder for them to rescue the victims. The fourth is St. Louis has a major drug problem, and Duncan states that a mother will allow a drug trafficker to use their child for sexual favors just to obtain drugs or money, and that is just very disturbing. And lastly, St. Louis is at a higher incidence of human trafficking because the east of the city is mainly poverty, leading back to homelessness, and anyone is trying to do anything for money, so they might get trapped into the human trafficking trade. Also, the Department of Justice hasn't helped out as much in the Eastern District as in the Western District, making the Eastern District more popular for human trafficking. The majority of the issues within human trafficking is with the police department. Andrea Nichols and Aaron Hill are both professors from colleges in the Midwest, and they state that in 163 police departments across the United States, only 12% of police officers believed human trafficking was a significant issue in their departments. 92% had not received any training in human trafficking, and 98% did not have specific policies in place to address trafficking. This is a huge issue for many victims in human trafficking, because if the police aren't calibrated on how to address human trafficking, they may miss a signal or a warning sign from a victim or someone that the victim knows. And it's just very important that police officers have the correct and adequate training required to identify these situations. If these policies aren't in place of the police department, then nothing can be done further to stop human trafficking. Victim reporting is another issue of human trafficking, because many victims feel like the police won't help them, or that they will charge them with something, making them go to jail, or they'll just simply ignore them because, as that statistic before from Nichols and Hale said, that a lot of police stations don't believe that human trafficking is a significant issue. So once a victim is rescued, the TVPA Act offers support and protection for the survivors. They will reunite families, and they will also offer counseling for the victims. And the three counseling that I found on Camelon, he's an author that wrote an article about reuniting families, is creative intervention, cognitive therapy, and group therapy.